Well, howdy there, stranger. I'm Jordy.
And I'm Brad.
And welcome back to Beers with Queers, the true crime podcast where I research a case and Brad here, and potentially you guys.
Don't know a damn thing about it.
So the case I have for y'all today is one that is honestly very concerning to me, if we're being honest. I first heard about this case towards the beginning of the podcast, when we were first starting out, starting to look at cases to kind of build up our episode backlog to cover and stuff like that. And honestly, it was actually going to be one of the very first episodes that we covered. But sadly, like a lot of the cases that we cover, there just wasn't that much information out there about it in order to make a proper full episode. And so I kind of pushed it to the back burner for a while until new details or information was made available, or if I got lucky enough to find anything. But a very, very major development happened towards the beginning of this year that legitimately left my jaw on the floor. Today, we're going to be talking about a forgotten serial killer, and one you've probably never heard of before. As far as I'm aware, we are the first podcast to cover this case, and like I always say, I'm not saying that as a brag, just as a way to show y'all that this case receives very little media attention. Now, we have covered forgotten serial killers on this podcast before, but what makes this one different is the fact that the killer was actually caught and prosecuted for his crimes. So, a pretty open and shut case, right? But what makes this case unique and also baffling and shocking is the fact that this serial killer is alive and well and walking free amongst us in society.
Well, that's interesting.
Oh, it's interesting and terrifying. So today we are going to be talking about the case of Warren Harris Jr., who would become known as the French Quarter Stabber after he brutally murdered 4 gay men and is strongly suspected of at least 2 other murders during a 3-month stretch of terror in New Orleans, 1977. So when I first started looking into this case, Warren was arrested guilty and had already been sitting behind bars for over 40 years. But in April of 2024, the parole board announced that they had actually granted Warren parole, and that same month he was released and is now once again free and roaming the street. So,
Which street?
Well, that's a question, so...
Well, you said roaming the street.
Roaming the streets. Typo. So how many known and convicted serial killers do you know that were found guilty, admitted to the murders, and then they actually got released? So that's what makes this case so shocking to me. It's like, I'm all for rehabilitation. That's one of the major things prison is for, is if they can be rehabilitated to integrate them back into society. However,
4 murders seems a bit excessive.
I was about to say, there are some crimes that are just kind of unforgivable. And I think being a serial killer is a pretty big crime, but we'll go over it. We're going to go through all the details that we have available to us. And, we'll just let you guys kind of get an idea if maybe you think he really is rehabilitated. So let's just jump right into it because it's wild, y'all. So sadly, this isn't really going to be like our normal episodes where I try to present the case in a sort of story format. So, hopefully it's easier to follow and digest. There's really not a whole lot of information about this case or the victims out there that's available to the public at least. So I'm going to give you guys all the facts that I could find, and then we will also be playing actual audio from Warren Harris's parole hearing, where he actually talks about the murders and his motivations. So before we do that, let me just give you guys a brief history of how New Orleans became a central hub for queer people during the 1900s. So kind of the same situation, like we talked about San Francisco and New York City. New Orleans would start to blossom into a queer utopia following the end of World War I and World War II. As we have talked about many times before on this podcast, during this time period, the Army was regularly hunting and seeking out any possible homosexuals in the military, and if even suspected of being gay, the Army would issue you what is known as a blue discharge, which was reserved for military members suspected of being gay. Now, during World War II alone, over 50,000 blue discharges were given, and if you were given one of these, you would immediately be kicked out and dropped off at the nearest port city in order to find your way back home. So, like San Francisco and New York, New Orleans was a major port city for a lot of military personnel, and that means thousands of gay men were dumped here to pick up the pieces of their lives. Of course, many found that it was impossible to go home or just didn't want to go home or to return to their life prior to joining the Army, as blue discharges were public knowledge, and that meant everyone would know that you were kicked out for being gay. So instead of returning home, many chose to set up roots right there in New Orleans, and by the 1940s, New Orleans already had a very colorful and active queer scene, which had began forming in the late 1880s. So, little history lessons here. This is actually really fun to research. I've always wanted to visit New Orleans, and so hopefully one day soon we can make it down there. So in 1805, New Orleans actually got rid of their sodomy laws, and by the 1850s, they also got rid of their prostitution laws, and now that meant people did not have to hide or be afraid of being arrested for engaging in either. The legalization of sodomy and prostitution led to many brothels, clubs, and bathhouses forming and popping up all over the city in the following years. Now, the vast majority of them are located in Storyville, New Orleans, which is where the, quote, unwanted or minorities of the city were forced to stay, ranging from people of color to homosexuals to even trans people. Now, here they formed a strong and vibrant community that indulged in colorful parties and self-expression all the way up until about 1917. And of course, that is when prostitution was once again banned by the local government, and the brothels and sex bars of Storyville were quickly torn down and bulldozed over to remove any trace of them. Now, following the destruction of Storyville, the outcasts of New Orleans had to find a new place to call home, and they found that place in the form of the French Quarter. Now, in 1917, the French Quarter was the least desirable place to be in New Orleans. The buildings that were there were abandoned and rotting. The area was considered to be seedy and trashy. But due to these conditions and the French Quarter's reputation at the time, the rent for buildings in the area was extremely cheap, and many former residents of Storyville swooped in, bought the place up, and began to turn it into this new utopia. Now, here's where the real roots of the modern-day New Orleans queer movement began to form. In what would become known as the French Quarter Renaissance, young queer people, mainly of color, began to reshape the quarter into colorful shops, bars, and exotic dance halls as jazz began to fully blossom in the area. Now, by the 1930s, the first true gay bars began popping up in the quarter, and actually, we've talked about this before, and I'm curious if Brad remembers what the oldest gay bar is that popped up in the French Quarter that's still running today.
I can't remember the name of it, but I remember the story of it.
Yeah, so it's a story. So we covered it in one of our episodes covering queer hauntings, and it was actually Café La Fille in Exile.
Café La Fille in Exile.
And also at the same time, a bar called the Powder Puff Beer Bar also opened in 1933. And although Powder Puff would be closed just a few short years after opening, Café La Fille is still in operation to this day and holds the distinction of being the oldest and longest operating gay bar in America, 91 years strong.
That's very impressive.
Yeah, so when you have people today, they're always like, oh, this, queers are just this new fad that just happened in the last 20 years. You can point them to that and be like, I can physically take you to a gay bar that's been in operation as a gay bar for 90 years.
Honestly, when you were talking about, you were like, people of color, gay people, and trans people had to leave, it's like, a lot of people are like, this trans movement is so new and everything, and it's like, no, it was just never talked about. No one ever acknowledged, and people still do not want to acknowledge it, but it's been around forever, folks.
Literally forever, and it's not like you can just say that. There's documented evidence of gender reassignment surgeries dating all the way back to the 1920s and stuff like that. So it's not a new concept.
It's just we actually get to talk about them now.
Yeah, we can openly talk about them now without the fear of being arrested.
For right now.
For now. Now, over the following decades, the underground queer scene of the French Quarter continued to grow as sailors and other visitors traveled from all around the world, and many eventually setting up roots in the quarter. So it's kind of like we talked with San Francisco and New York City. Around this time, they sort of became beacons for queer people. Even if they didn't really realize they were queer, you would hear stories of like all this open queerness in this area, like everyone loves each other and they don't have to worry. And so you go there, visit, realize you can be yourself there, and then you move there, and it's just this slow buildup of what it is today. So by the time Stonewall happened in 1969, many historians would actually state that gay liberation was already well underway in the French Quarter and had been since the 1950s. Stonewall sparked the modern-day gay liberation movement, which did help many in the queer scene of New Orleans come forward and demand equal rights. So although there was more progression and there was already very vocal groups advocating for queer rights in New Orleans, Stonewall and the gay liberation movement kind of gave them the push they needed to be like, okay, we're not asking you anymore, we're demanding. So for the next 4 years, the queer scene thrived in New Orleans and only seemed to be growing louder, bolder, and more open in their queerness. But sadly, tragedy would strike in one of the absolute worst ways possible, and it happened on June 24th, 1973. We also covered this case before, and I'm wondering if Brad remembers which one.
This is the fire.
It is the fire, yes. So a still unidentified person set fire to the Upstairs Lounge nightclub in downtown New Orleans. The blaze lasted for close to 20 minutes and resulted in the deaths of 32 people, making it the worst attack on LGBT people until the 2016 Pulse shooting. And like I said, we covered this case in full detail in episode 31 if you want to hear the whole story. Now, the tragedy was, of course, a gut punch to the queer community all over the country, as public response was a mixture of hatred and bigotry, with one of the most infamous quotes from that time was during the fire. One of the firemen was overheard actually saying, quote, "Let the faggots burn." So, it gives you an idea of how hostile times were back then. So, however, sadly, unlike Stonewall, the Upstairs Lounge tragedy didn't unite the New Orleans queer scene, and instead terrified them and drove many to go back into hiding. This setback, after 4 years of open liberation, caused the local government to begin cracking down on homosexuality. Starting in 1976, local law enforcement began conducting raids and arrests in popular gay cruising areas around the city, and this resulted in over 70 men being arrested for, quote, lewd behavior in the month of June alone. Now, when questioned about this, law officials stated that the increase in arrests and raids was an attempt to combat the, quote, countless calls that had been receiving of concerned parents worried their children would stumble upon these sex acts in public. Which, fair, very, very fair. But also, they kind of argue, they're like, these acts are not happening in broad daylight. They're happening at like 4 a.m.
Also, they're having to happen in these places because you've taken away all the other places they could do it in private.
Yeah, so it's like, what do you expect them to do? So after these police raids, pretty soon rumors began to spread around New Orleans that the public parks were now being used by homosexuals to prey on young children, and a public moral outrage began to form, with many citizens now thinking that homosexuals were a threat to their families and it needed to be taken care of. So as 1976 turned to 1977, these, of course, very false rumors would only increase, sadly, as an incident would occur that only seemed to confirm the rumors that homosexuals were predators. So towards the beginning of 1977, news broke that 3 men, who were all Boy Scout leaders with Troop 137 in New Orleans East, were arrested and charged with grooming and molesting multiple boys between the ages of 8 and 12. Now, the men would eventually lead police to a child sex abuse ring that included upwards of 20 people and over 30 victims in the surrounding area. So, of course, once this news broke, it sent hysteria throughout the city as parents became terrified that their children would be the next victim. Now, local news outlets did not help this situation any at all, and if anything, they made it worse. So instead of reporting the incident for what it was, which was just a sadistic ring of pedophiles and child predators, they instead chose to refer to it as a, quote, sophisticated abuse ring of homosexuals. So it did not help that the 3 men arrested for the abuse were charged with, quote, crimes against nature, which was the exact same charge gay men caught having sex would also be charged with. So again, we've talked about this in a few episodes before. There's not a distinction between the two. So 2 consenting grown men having sex would be charged with the exact same crimes as a literal literal pedophile child predator. And of course, in prison and in public, you can't explain that away. All the public knows is you were charged with the same thing as a child predator. So yeah, lumping literal child predators in with consenting adults. So by this point, the climate towards the queer community of New Orleans was not very good. Tensions were high with the police and the public at large, who now saw all of them as predators. But things were about to go from bad to worse when the news that a body had just been found brutally murdered began to spread throughout the French Quarter. So that's your little history lesson, also just to give you an idea of the climate that New Orleans was in when the murder started. So on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1977, the body of 46-year-old Robert Gary was found murdered inside of his apartment at 622 Domain Street after he failed to show up for work. Inside, police found Robert partially nude, lying on the bedroom floor in a pool of blood, having been stabbed over 20 times in the neck, chest, and back. Now, due to Robert being halfway undressed and the presence of other sexual items, it appeared to investigators that Robert had been attacked while he was in the midst of a sexual encounter with his attacker. Talking with several of Robert's friends and co-workers, they learned that Robert was a single gay man who lived alone and often frequented the bars in the French Quarter at night, such as Café La Fille, Corner Pocket, and Bourbon Pub. Now, several witnesses remembered seeing Robert talking with an unknown man the night before his body was found, although no one could remember specific details. The case quickly came to a dead end with no potential leads turning up, and investigators chalked the murder up to either a, quote, sex act gone wrong or a robbery gone wrong, and left it at that. And if you've listened to our Doodler episodes, you'll know.
If you've listened to a lot of episodes, you know the police don't normally give a shit.
Yeah, if it involves a gay man, especially someone who looks like they were murdered in the midst of a homosexual act, it's always going to be a lover's quarrel or something like that. So even though they left Robert's murder as just kind of a random act of violence, this would change 5 weeks after Robert's murder, when on March 21st, 1977, a similar crime scene would be found, suggesting to investigators and the public at large that there was a killer on the loose. That day, friends showed up to the apartment of 37-year-old Jack Savall, located on 820 Esplanade Street, after growing concern that he didn't show up for work. Upon entering the apartment, they were met with a horrific sight. Jack lying on the floor, nude and covered in blood, having been stabbed 18 times in the chest and back. Semen was also found in Jack's body and several articles of clothing in the bedroom, suggesting, like Robert's murder, Jack had been attacked while in the middle of a homosexual act with his killer. Jack's wallet and several expensive pieces of jewelry were also missing from the scene, suggesting robbery as a possible motive. Now, like Robert, Jack was an openly gay man who lived alone, close to the French Quarter, and would often frequent the gay bars there at night. Like Robert's murder, there was very few leads into Jack's murder, and again, investigators chalked it up to most likely being a robbery gone wrong or a sex act gone wrong.
That does not surprise me, because that's very similar to like the Doodler as well. It's like takes like 4 or 5 murders before they're like, you know what, this might be connected.
Yeah, it takes them about 5, and they're like, well, okay, maybe it's not so random. But even though investigators didn't seem to be taking the case seriously, the French Quarter queer scene was now more than on edge about a possible serial killer walking among them. Fear was at an all-time high, as on top of Robert and Jack's murder, a third murder had occurred between the two that many felt were the work of the same killer. So on March 2nd, the body of 32-year-old James McClure was found in a vacant lot behind a gas station on Esplanade Street. He had been stabbed 10 times and was missing his wallet like the other 2 victims, and was a known gay man who frequented the French Quarter. So, with 3 stabbing deaths occurring in just a 5-week period, many in the community began to grow concerned. One bartender at Café Lafite was later interviewed and stated that paranoia and fear were rampant during this time. Nobody walked alone, everyone made sure to walk in groups of 3 or more, and everyone became suspicious of everyone else. People stopped taking random strangers home to have sex, and a sense of dread was just lingering over the dance floor. And this sense of dread and fear of a serial killer was only further driven home with the discovery of another murder just a week after Jack Sovell's. So on April 1st, 1977, friends went to the apartment of 59-year-old Alden Delano, located at 1421 Royal Avenue, after he failed to show up for work. Inside, they found him lying nude in his bed, covered in blood, and with blood sprayed all over the walls around him. He had been stabbed over 30 times. Alden's murder had all the same characteristics as Robert and Jack's, and again appeared to have occurred during a homosexual encounter between Alden and his killer. One interesting thing investigators were able to find was that Alden and Jack actually knew each other, as both worked with Orleans for music. Now, whether this had anything to do with the motive, or if that meant they also knew their killer, remained unseen. Despite 4 murders in the span of just 6 weeks, all of them committed against gay men, and 3 out of the 4 having the exact same M.O., the chief of police at the time actually made a public statement, quote, he felt there was no public threat to the gay community. Now, despite protests from various queer organizations around the city, police refused to do anything or up patrols in the French Quarter. So normally, especially during this time, queer people would be like, so that should really show you how bad things are, because normally, especially during this time, queer people don't want police presence anywhere near them or any of the queer bars or anything like that. And so the fact that they're actively like, we want you to up patrols in our area because we're that terrified, should really show you how desperate and bad they were to catch this killer. Now, many in the queer community felt that due to how similar the crime scenes were, the killer must be a gay hustler who picked up men somewhere in the French Quarter, and this led to multiple bars and establishments banning hustling and kicking anyone out who looked like they were cruising in an attempt to stop the murders. But less than a week after Alden's murder, another would occur. On April 7th at 7:30 in the morning, family members of 77-year-old Ernest Pommier went to his ground floor apartment located on Esplanade Avenue after failing to get a hold of him, and upon entering, they discovered a gruesome scene. Ernest was found in the living room in a kneeling position, hunched over. He was missing his pants and underwear and had been stabbed 78 times. Although police immediately linked Ernest's murder to those of the previous 4 victims, several noticeable differences were found. Noticeably, Ernest was much older than the other victims and was found kneeling in the living room instead of in the bedroom. On top of that, Ernest was not known to be gay or frequent gay bars in the French Quarter like the other victims. So, now of course, not saying he is gay, but this doesn't really mean much. This is the 1970s. After all, a lot of people were in the closet. So it is a high probability, especially since he was missing his pants and underwear, it was a sexual encounter.
And this is like, what, the 3rd that's happened on the same street?
It is the 3rd that's happened on the same street. And I noticed that too. And it's not really brought up in everything I've read about this case. But I was like, most of these murders also seem to be like one street. So following the 5th murder, it was clear that the killer, now dubbed the French Quarter Stabber, was escalating. His attacks were becoming more
escalating. He's killed like 5 people in like 5 weeks. He's killing a person a week.
Yeah, and so it's kind of like Jack the Ripper. Like the last murder, Ernest's murder, was by far the most brutal. Almost 100 times he was stabbed. So it was clear not only was the attacks happening more frequently, like there was a 5-week gap between the first 2, and then after that it was like 1 a week, and each murder just seems to be getting more and more angry and more violent. So now police are like, okay, well, now we should probably take this seriously because this guy is getting very crazy, frequent. His attacks are more frequent. So
yeah, and if I lived on Esplanade Street, I'd be multiply worried because 3 people's died on that street already.
yeah, I would be too. That's very concerning. Now, a 5-person task force was formed by investigators to begin seriously hunting down New Orleans' latest serial killer. A profile was established by investigators who knew, due to the nature of the crimes, the killer had to be homosexual or someone who struggled with, quote, homosexual tendencies, which caused him to target gay men with rage. Now, over the course of the next week, following Ernest's murder, police finally did begin cracking down on gay hustling in the French Quarter, with many young men being arrested and taken in for questioning, since this is also how it's believed the French Quarter stabber was finding his victims. As a panic began to sweep across the city, as an active serial killer was now on the loose, and investigators had few clues to his identity, initially it didn't seem likely that the French Quarter stabber would be caught before his next murder. And sadly, this assumption was right, as a 6th victim would be found. But unlike the previous 5 victims, this victim survived. On April 12th, an unidentified man described only as being a, quote, French sailor would come forward to police stating he had just survived an attack by a young African-American male after meeting him in the French Quarter. The sailor had taken the young man back to his apartment, where he was almost immediately attacked by the young man, who pulled a butcher knife from his coat pocket and began to violently stab him. The young man took the sailor's wallet, and during this time he was able to fight him off long enough to escape from the apartment and run to get help. Of course, investigators were interested because this sounded exactly like the stabber's MO, and they began to put out calls for any possible witnesses who may know who this young man is. So, although we still aren't sure of the circumstances of who investigators talked to or how they knew the killer, on April 13th, a police informant came forward with information telling police that the man who attacked the sailor, and who was probably the French Quarter stabber, was an acquaintance of his named Warren Harris. Now, later that same day, police obtained an arrest warrant and went to the top floor of the Duke Hotel on North Claiborne Avenue, where Warren was known to be living. Inside, police found Warren along with his roommate, a young transgender woman. Warren was arrested and charged with the attempted murder of the French sailor and taken back to the station for questioning, along with his mother and grandmother, who were called to come sit in on the interrogation because Warren was just 16 years old.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, 16 years old, a literal teenager, a child.
And also, he's got a roommate, which means he's not at home.
No?
16 years old.
So, and we'll see, like, there's not much information about Warren, but you'll see he kind of had a rough go at things. Now, during his interrogation, Warren admitted to stabbing and robbing the French sailor, and eventually the questioning turned to the other stabbings that had occurred in the French Quarter. Now, we do not know if Warren offered this information willingly or if he was threatened or strong-armed, but at some point he openly admitted to having committed 4 murders over the last 2.5 months. When pressed for further information, Warren was adamant that he was not gay and that, in fact, he had a, quote, revulsion towards homosexuals and believed it to be a sin. He stated that he began working as a hustler in the French Quarter in order to support his heroin addiction, and that the motive for all the murders was robbery. Now, the revelation that Warren was a serial killer shook his mother and grandmother, who were present with both in complete disbelief that he was capable of such horrific acts. His mother later told reporters, quote, "Unless he has split personalities, I can't see him doing that. I know my child. He's no saint, but I honestly don't think he's capable of this."
No mother thinks that, though.
Of course not. You don't want to think that. It also wasn't clear which aspect his family was more upset about, the fact that he was accused of multiple murders, or the fact that he had engaged in sex with men, and now people were reporting that he was gay. His mother also stated, quote, "He's a good-hearted child. He's had girlfriends. He likes girls. He is not a homosexual." So this aversion to homosexuality does make sense considering Warren came from a very, religious background. Although information about his past is scarce, we know he was one of 6 children born to his mother and father, with his father abandoning the family not long after his birth. His biggest male role model in his life was his grandfather, who was a Baptist minister. The children were raised to believe homosexuality was one of the greatest sins you could commit. And from an early age, Warren showed signs of trouble when at just 13 years old in 1974, he was arrested and placed in a youth home after stealing a car and for a string of purse snatchings. So at some point over the next few years, Warren dropped out of the 8th grade and then moved out of his mother's home and moved into a room at the Duke Hotel with his transgender friend, and at some point began using and became addicted to heroin. Whether it really was his heroin addiction or just his revulsion towards gay men was not really known. But that didn't matter, because while in custody, Warren signed 3 different typed confessions admitting to the murders of Robert Gary, Jack Savall, Alden Delano, and Ernest Pommier. Investigators would later announce that they believed the murder of James McClure was an unrelated robbery gone wrong, and Warren most likely wasn't involved. Which makes sense also. It's the only one that doesn't really fit the other MOs of the murders, except for the fact that the victim was stabbed to death. Warren was officially arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder on April 14th and taken into custody. The news of Warren's arrest sent shockwaves across New Orleans and the whole country for that matter, as like I said, Warren was just 16 years old and had just admitted to killing 4 men in just 2 months, making him one of the youngest serial killers in American history. But this wasn't about to be a simple open and shut case, as not long after he was arrested, Warren would recant his confession and then accuse multiple officers of threatening to murder him if he didn't confess. Warren stated officers present at the interrogation told him that they would murder him before dumping his body in the river if he didn't sign the confessions. So for several months, an investigation was launched to prove the validity of these accusations, and it was eventually determined in September of 1977 that no such threats had been made and the trial could continue. Now, due to the nature of the crimes, Warren's lawyers knew prosecutors were going to try and go for the death penalty, and they were right. They were aiming for the death penalty. So in order to prevent this from happening, his team filed a motion challenging his eligibility for the death penalty, stating it was, quote, cruel and unusual punishment, given that Warren was still underage. The issue was actually taken up by the Supreme Court, who ruled in Warren's favor, agreeing that giving someone underage the death penalty would be cruel and unusual. Now, following this, his defense argued that each murder should be given its own trial and that one should not be tied or interfere with the other. So what that means, they can't be lumped together. Each trial is specifically about that one specific murder with no mention of the others involved. So Warren would not be tried as a serial killer. It would be 4 individual murder trials, single murder trials.
That seems odd, but I see where the defense would want it to be like that.
Yeah, because you're more likely to get possibility of parole or something if it's one murder, but if they try them together, and it's like, no, he systematically murdered 4 men over the course of just like 2 months, it seems a little bit more worse.
Yeah, I mean, nobody's going to be like, yeah, this guy could possibly get parole out of this.
So in November of 1977, Warren would go to trial 4 different times for the murders of Robert, Jack, Alden, and Ernest. He would be found guilty of first-degree murder in the cases of Jack, Alden, and Ernest. However, the charges for Robert Gary's murder were dropped due to lack of evidence. On November 18, 1977, Warren Harris was found guilty for 3 murders and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility for parole. Throughout his trial, he maintained his innocence, as did his mother and grandmother, who believed that police had the wrong guy. So for over 40 years, this is where this case ended. Warren was placed in jail and began serving his sentence. The queer community of New Orleans slowly started to heal, and the memory of the French Quarter stabber began to quickly fade as we entered the 80s, and a new enemy came for the queer community in the form of the AIDS epidemic. So that's a thing, too, of learning, like, researching these more obscure queer-related serial killers and homosexual cases is a lot of the time you wonder, like, why don't I hear about this more? Like, why isn't this covered more? And the sad reality is a lot of them got overshadowed by the AIDS epidemic. A lot of witnesses, a lot of survivors were wiped out. So a lot of people who could keep the story alive, sadly, are no longer with us.
And honestly, the reason we do this podcast is because there's so many gay stories that just drop through the cracks and no one talks about them. And that's just a given. That's still going on today. So it doesn't surprise me that stories like this fall through the cracks. It's like, who wants to report on gay people's problems, like serial killers and everything like that, unless it's very much usually against the gay community, and then they're really happy to talk all about it. But when it's just the victims are in the gay community, a lot of times it's like, it'll get mentioned, and then all of a sudden it just drops.
Yeah, and that, like he said, that's one of the reasons we did the podcast, because if you look online, you can find all these, like, major serial killers that have killed, like, 20-some people, and it's like, you have never heard of them before. And it's like, because most of their victims are gay men in the 70s, 80s, when, to put it bluntly, the majority of the public didn't care. So the story of 5 gay men brutally murdered and a city terrorized went underreported for decades after this, and it seemed the case was destined to remain hidden and forgotten. That is, until 2021, when it was announced that Warren Harris would be eligible to potentially have his life sentence reduced. So to explain how we got there, it started in 2017 when the governor of Louisiana, John Bel Edwards, announced plans to update the state's imprisonment laws. Up to this point, the state actually had the highest imprisonment rate of any state in the nation. In an attempt to combat this, the state was looking to reduce their prison population by about 10%, and one way they were going to do this is through a new law which would be introduced that would allow for the re-examination of cases where a juvenile under the age of 18 was given a life sentence without the possibility for parole. So this went in tandem with a recent Supreme Court ruling which stated that giving anyone under the age of 18 a life sentence without the possibility for parole was cruel and unusual punishment, and that if underage at the time of the crime, must be given the chance for parole. So a law was passed in Louisiana on June 15th, 2017, that caused officials to go back and look at current prisoners who committed their crimes when they were juveniles, and one of those cases was that of Warren Harris. Now, who was told his case would be re-examined in 2021. After reviewing everything, Warren's sentence was changed from life without parole to life with the possibility of parole, which he soon became eligible for starting in 2024. So, Warren Harris went before a parole board on April 17th, 2024, just a few days after the 47th anniversary of when he was caught. So to start things off, the parole board, made up of 3 members, asked who was there to speak on Warren Harris's behalf, which included his attorney, his sister-in-law, Roberta Harris, Brenda Palmer, Warren's sister, Warren's niece, a male friend of the family, and several staff members from Angola Prison where Warren was serving his sentence. So he had a lot of people in his corner. Sadly, no family members or friends of any of Warren's victims were present at the hearing. Why that is not known, although it ranges anywhere from the victims' families having disowned them for being gay, or maybe they weren't even aware that the hearing was happening. Whatever the reason, sadly, none of them were there to give a voice to the murder victims.
Plus, 47 years has passed, so that's a long time. There's probably a lot of them that are dead.
And that's the sad reality, too. This is almost half a century has passed since these crimes happened. And like we just said, a lot, even if family members didn't want to speak, friends can also speak for the victim's behalf, too. But again, this occurred right before the AIDS epidemic, so there is a sad reality that a lot of them may not have made it.
And I mean, Warren himself at this point would be like 63 years old.
Yep.
And he was 16 when it happened. And I would say most of his victims' families were older than that. So you're talking like probably 70 plus that any of the victims or the victims' direct families would be. So there's probably not a lot of them left.
No, and that really sucks. That's very sad, honestly, just to think about how much time has passed and just the fact that there was no one there to speak in the defense of the victims.
And again, it's 4 victims.
Yeah, it was 4 people that had friends, family, countless interactions, people that loved them. Now, although Warren denied knowing or having any previous encounters with his victims before the murders, several reports came out after his initial arrest back in 1977 that Warren had actually been seen accompanying Jack Sawville to Mardi Gras on February 20th, 1977, just a week after Robert's murder and 5 weeks before Jack's own murder. So during his parole hearing, he's like, I had no interaction. These are all crimes of opportunity. I didn't know any of the victims before I met them and murdered them. And he said that to the parole board, but there were reports during the initial 77 investigation that he had interactions with at least one of them weeks before their murder. So after reviewing the details of the case and Warren's version of why he did it, the parole board allowed for those present in support of him to speak. The parole board voted 2-1 for Warren Harris to be granted parole. Per his parole, Warren Harris will have to undergo drug tests every 6 months for the rest of his life and will also remain on probation for the rest of his life. And with that, Warren Harris was officially released from prison on April 22nd, 2024. Although we know he was released into the custody of his sister and is residing with her, his current whereabouts remain unknown. Now, although I understand that prison is meant for rehabilitation, and Warren Harris, depending on how you look at it, seems to have been rehabilitated and taken the right steps towards becoming a productive member of society. But also,
4 people.
Can a serial killer, someone who preyed on and murdered 4 innocent men, really change? Now, only time will tell what will happen to Warren now that he is free, and like one parole board member said, the world will be watching. And as of now, that is the story of Warren Harris, aka the French Quarter Stabber. And also, it's one of those things like, he was that big and infamous of a serial killer that he got his own moniker. So, like, when a case gets really big, the news media always invents some wacky moniker to call them. They can't just call them their name. So the fact that a man known as the French Quarter Stabber was released from prison is baffling to me.
And he's just 63. I know that seems really old, but 63 is still, you got some spryness in you. You can still get into mischief.
You can. And also, you know what? Maybe he will become a productive member of society. Not my place to say, but also, I don't think someone who murdered 4 people, one of which he stabbed over 78 times, couldn't really be rehabilitated. But
well, I think even if you feel rehabilitated, I mean, there's got to be some kind of justice. Like 4 people, I know a human life, there's nothing that the value compares to and everything. And so I'm not saying like, oh, if he just done 1, then it was, he should get out and everything. I'm not saying that, because I am a believer that when you do a crime, you got to pay the punishment for it. But 4, like, not 2, not 3, 4 people, and you still get out of prison?
Who you stabbed to death. It's not even like it was like quick, painless death. It was a brutal, close, personal, painful, multiple times. One was stabbed 30 times, one was 50, one was 78. These were rage-filled killings. And also, like one of the only parole board member that voted, and also the only parole board member who voted to deny Warren parole, even gave his reasoning. He said, it's kind of like if a smoker gets cancer and then stops smoking, they still have the cancer. And he was kind of referring like, yeah, Warren stopped killing, but he's still a serial killer.
He stopped killing because he was in prison.
He got caught. Also, he attempted to murder someone else, so almost 5 people. He could have had 5 victims, and he wouldn't have stopped until he got caught. So that's
the other thing. He was killing a person a week at this point. Like, one just happened to escape. Otherwise, he would have also been a victim, and then there would have been a victim after him.
And also, it's kind of a point of controversy in what his actual motive was, because he also said at the parole board his motive was that he was addicted to heroin and he needed money to support his habit, so he turned to hustling and then would just murder them to rob them. But at the same time, he told investigators that he was repulsed by homosexuals and that he hated them. So was it really just to support his heroin addiction, or was it hate crimes, essentially? Because he hated homosexuals, and especially during that climate back then, like I was saying, where there was this heightened sense, this misconception that homosexuals were predators. Did that have something to do with it? So, who knows? But as of now, there's a serial killer that was granted parole from prison, and that is the only one I know of that has had happen. So, we will see if there are any updates. Of course, we will let you guys know immediately. But you know what? Positive thoughts, maybe.
Thoughts and prayers.
And thoughts and prayers. And with that, thank you guys so much for tuning in for another episode. If you enjoyed this episode and the podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating or review on iTunes or Spotify. Helps us out a lot, helps other people discover the podcast, and of course, we just love hearing from you guys. If you want to see photos from this case, you can follow us on Instagram at Beers with Queers Pod, that's P-O-D, or on Facebook at Beers with Queers, a true crime podcast. And until Monday, stay dangerous out there, my friend.
See you soon.
Bye.